Hello, everyone. This is Tijen Genco. I am Master Certified Coach and Board Certified Health and Wellness Coach. This is Coaching with Mastery and Elegance with Tijen Genco. And today we have such a pleasure to host Dr. Hollis with us. And Dr. James Hollis is distinguished Jungian psychoanalyst, educator, and author. He's dedicated his career exploring the depths of human psyche and helping individuals finding meaning in their lives. He holds a PhD from Drew University and trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich. Over the years, he has authored numerous influential books, including Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life and Hauntings, Dispelling the Ghosts Who Run Our Lives. Dr. Hollis, PhD, is a co-founder of C.G. Jung Institutes of Philadelphia and has also served as the executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston and Jung Society of Washington. Currently, he runs a private practice in Washington, D.C., where he continues to guide and inspire many on their journeys of self-discovery and personal growth, including my own. Welcome, Dr. Hollis.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you.
I appreciate you being here. And today we're going to discuss about human shadow, exploration of shadow, and you've been guide and master journeyer to those lands. So I'm going to start us with question of how would you describe the shadow and its function in our lives?
Well, the shadow, I think the simplest definition, my definition at least, is the shadow embodies those aspects of ourselves, often of which we are unconscious, or we're conscious, but we find difficulty in dealing with them, or those elements that are part of our affiliations with institutions of various kinds, that when we bring them to consciousness, we find them troubling, perhaps contradictory to our own self-image. Perhaps asking something of us that might seem very challenging. You know, Jung said once, the biggest shadow we all have is we live such small lives, adaptive lives. Because one thing that was common to all of us as children was the core message, and it wasn't inaccurate. The world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So how are you going to cope with that? So we have to make all kinds of adaptations. We internalize all kinds of messages from our family and our culture and our time in history. All of those factors are influencing our sense of self and sense of values. And the shadow, again, represents the parts of us that we don't really want to acknowledge. On the one hand, it includes our capacity for self-deception, perhaps for manipulation of others. Our capacities for deceit, or capacity to be fear-driven or envious of others, qualities we don't want to recognize in ourselves. But you know, why would we be exempt from the human condition? We're the carrier of the human species, and so all that is possible of humankind is found within us. And on the other hand, there are elements of ourselves that we find are not comforting or perhaps are challenging to us, such as growing up, having to take responsibility for our lives, being accountable, or our spontaneity, or the mixture of feelings we might have about any particular situation. So in general, it's important not to associate the shadow with evil, although evil can come from that. Again, it's those parts of our humanity that make our ego consciousness sort of nervous, make it have to face certain kinds of consequences. You know, we all say we mean well, we have good intentions, but whatever spills into the world is coming out of us. And you know, the only person present in that long-running drama that we call our lives is ourselves. The shadow is very complex, and it's a rich source of energy. Jung said a shadowless person is a superficial person, you know, a person just who's adaptive to the environment, for example, and trying to stay out of harm's way always. And their shadow is their unlived life. And I think each of us have an accountability for that shadow, or we'll just keep spilling onto our children, our partners, and our society.
Mm. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that in your explanation, that's beautiful. There is the cognitive distortive processing, as well as the ego formed and we uh, individuated somewhat into our life. Then we find certain um, unconscious formations that contradictory to that whatever we think we are, and therefore we find it, as you mentioned, nervous or uncomfortable when we start to express that part of ourselves in a way when we don't want to. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's lovely. So now I know that, and I adore your metaphors around that you use very challenging metaphors as you invite others to explore the shadows, such as the underworld, the dark woods, swamplands. And as a master teacher and a guide and an analyst, what benefits do you see just naming them as such, as you also invite others to the benefits of exploration?
Well, first of all, um, we all have a shadow, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, and it's constantly spilling into the world, as I just mentioned, and influencing our relationships with other people. I've often asked clients through the years about a certain behavior or a certain pattern. Now, what is that in service to inside of you? I may think I've done a good thing, but if I really get down into the depths of where that came from, it might be an old codependent thing, an act of that kind of powerlessness of childhood that we carry with us in the face of, our fears or not wanting to cause a disturbance with the other and so forth. Or it's a fear-based response, or it's a power-driven complex that is at work within us. So that one word accountability, I think, is central here. We are accountable for what spills into the world through us. And much of it's coming from these archaic agendas that we're carrying from our history, or rising out of, the mixed motives that human beings have much of the time. So again, underneath all of this, we have to ask this question, all right, what is this really in service to inside of me? I have to say really, because you can't particularly trust your first response. That will be the rationalization. Well, I said that because you said this, or you
Mhm.
failed to do this or do that. In other words, I just disowned my own shadow in that moment. And we learned as children to do that because it's difficult to put the spotlight on these aspects of our personalities. And we learned as children, for example, to maybe lie to others to stay out of harm's way. It was a reasonable motive at the time, but we also wind up lying to ourselves at times. So again, whatever is true within us can itself be a challenge, because then it asks of us, first of all, to achieve consciousness, and then to be responsible for what we find. And that takes a lot of courage. It takes maturation. An immature person is always blaming somebody else. It's
Mm.
certainly true that grievous things could have happened to us along the way. That's not to be denied. However, we're responsible for what's playing out in our lives now. We're not just victims. We are people who are, in charge of the governance of our lives. And if we turn too much of our avoidant behavior or manipulative behavior over onto others, then we're simply perpetuating that lack of growth or lack of awareness. Jung said once, the single best thing you can do for society is sort of clean up your own backyard.
Mm.
And it's also true of our relationships, particularly intimate relationships, parent-child relationships. What I've not faced in myself is going to be playing out in the field with others. Children will have to grow up either repeating our avoidant patterns, for example, or be spending their life trying to get away from them. Either way, they're influenced profoundly by what they see in us overtly and what they experience often covertly in their relationships with us.
Mm. So what I'm hearing is that exploring these, whatever we call it in the left and the dark and the shadow, are supportive of, as you mentioned, self-accountability, self-sovereignty, and full governance of whatever this is. But I wonder that, I mean, I also use challenging metaphors to share the behavior when I observe in my clients, but they then may not like if I invite them to a journey into the underworld or journey into the swampland. So, what made you choose these metaphors as you believe in the importance of exploration, and how are your clients responding to those?
Well, first of all, denied or accepted, the shadow is playing out in our lives in any case. So if a person's not wanting to be accountable for their behaviors, their choices, and how it affects people around them, then there's not much we can do for them. And the truth is, sooner or later, all of us will go to these swampland experiences. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Swamplands of the Soul that dealt with the role of fear and anxiety in our lives, what happens when depression occurs, as it will at some point in one's life, where we experience betrayal or loss, or maybe self-treatment plans that lead to addictions and so forth. There are for each of us these appointments with difficult times in life. You can never avoid them. They happen, whether through fate or consequence of our choices or whatever. So at midlife, I had this depression, and I had to ask the question, why has my psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval, its support of my carefully calculated and energized agenda? You know, our first thought would be, well, how quickly do I get rid of this problem? Well, that's understandable. But as we know, haste makes waste. And so I had to rather ask the question, why has it come? What is it asking of me? And how much is being pressed down? A depression is where something in us that's wanting expression is being pressed down, whether its source is biological or environmental or more commonly intrapsychic. And then you began to realize there's something inside of each of us that knows us better than we know ourselves. It's seeking its fuller expression in the world. And that greater expression may be blocked by our circumstances of outer life, or it may be because of certain attitudes or fears or adaptations that we acquired earlier in our development, so that we become, as the cliche tells us, our own worst enemy. So it was the beginning, I think, of my descent into the underworld, so to speak, to discern what this was all about, which is when I began my first sessions of therapy. At the time, I didn't feel I'm starting the second half of my life. I'm going to move from a life in academia, which I valued at the time, into the world of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. But it was a significant transition, and I began to realize there is for each of us an invitation to a deeper conversation around the meaning of our journey. Why are we here? In service to what? And again, don't trust your first answers. They're usually the convenient answers, the one that papers over the real issue, that helps us avoid confronting what is really roiling within each of us. And sooner or later, that appointment with the depth with which we all, have to contend, and which ultimately are supportive. If it's true, and I believe it is, that there's something in us that knows us better than we know ourselves consciously, because we get identified with our adaptations, our stories that our lives have evolved. But underneath is our nature seeking its expression. And wherever it's violated, it's going to show up symptomatically. So from a psychoanalytic perspective, we don't say, how quickly do I get rid of the symptoms? We have to say, I want to respect the autonomy of the psyche to produce its protest, because the protest is getting our attention. If I keep running from that appointment, it'll simply increase its intensity and increase, of course, its consequences. So the question is, do we show up in our lives as who we really are? I don't mean this in any narcissistic way or self-absorption, quite the contrary. This kind of conversation is always humbling. Doesn't make you feel good necessarily, but it makes you more fully human and it makes you more authentic rather than simply the creature of adaptation that we all had to acquire in our formation.
What a beautiful explanation. So what I'm hearing there is to recognition of these particular symptoms or some kind of things that we don't like, that shadow presents as an invite for further exploration of what we not necessarily think we are, but to discover the hidden potential that's more inclusive to our being and what is their self-expression. How, yeah. So then, Dr. Hollis, when, and as you said it, I've been through many swamplands and journeys like that myself, but I love discovery. So when somebody hasn't been in a journey at all like that, what would you recommend as they prepare their first swampland exploration? How can they prepare?
Well, I don't know that, first of all, we prepare for them because life happens to us, and that's what calls you to this accountability. Let me just mention, for example, another way to see the shadow at work that I think everybody would understand is people often have serial relationships, whether they're intimate relationships or friendships of some kind, and they often turn out in the same way. And it's easy to say, well, there's something wrong with these people. But again, the person that's consistently present in all those relationships is me. So I have to say, what is it that I am bringing to the table in my relationships with other people? Now, sometimes those difficulties would reach the magnitude of what we call swamplands, and you realize unwittingly you brought this about yourself, because whatever it is in your mode of operation, your sense of self, you brought into and affected the dynamics of that relationship, even including, ironically, sometimes unconsciously choosing people who can help us replicate or repeat the dismal outcomes of previous relationships. As you know, children who've been abused often will marry an abuser, for example. Why would a person do that? Well, because their sense of self and their sense of relationship and strategies with that other often have a kind of script-like character. And so one is drawn to what is familiar, often with the forlorn hope that next time it'll be better. But the conditions that have set that up often, again, produce the same old, same old. Because there's one central principle of relationships is that no relationship, whether it's parent-child, intimate partners, or even friendships, no relationship is any more evolved than the relationship I have to myself. Where I'm stuck, where I'm avoidant, where I'm caught in old scripts, it will show up in the relationship. It always does. So you realize that the swamplands, so to speak, are always hovering around the edge. You never quite know when you're going to walk into them. So am I saying everybody should be in therapy or be seeing a coach? Not necessarily. Although there are times when it's very helpful to get the perspective of another person. We have to remember that the word psychotherapy, coming from the Greek, means to pay attention to or to listen to the soul. When we call psychopathology, namely when we have these symptoms, again, the etymology says it's the expression of the suffering of the soul. So it has to do with one's deepest felt core, that within us that is seeking expression in the world. For example, I cannot tell you how many people in the professional spheres I've seen through the years didn't really feel a calling to their work, but they felt, for example, the world of parental expectations, a large number of them in the medical profession, interestingly enough, nurses and doctors. Many people who are psychotherapists often have come from very troubled family of origins, not always, but a significant percentage. and they are in some way identified as a sensitive child with trying to stabilize the environment. And so it hooks them in. And a big shadow issue there is, well, you may have gone to school, you may have prepared sincerely for the work you're doing, but in some way, you're trying to heal a very old agenda within your family or your own history. And it binds you to that trouble, ironically. And that's one reason why one has to work this through. I know in the analytic training institutes, the most important experience we have of learning is our own personal analysis. We're required to be in long-term analysis for years. That doesn't guarantee anything. It simply means that you are going to sooner or later have to start facing some of the issues that come up. And, as Jung said, we can't take a person any further than we've traveled ourselves. And I think that's important because where I'm stuck, where I'm serving the old agendas, such as avoidance or compliance, give them what they want, stay out of harm's way, etc. I was raised to be a good child, as I think most people are, with the best of intentions. But, when is the good the enemy of the better? Being good meant being adaptive, fitting in, following the script, do what you're supposed to do in some way. And I think that was part of why I was depressed. There was all this life underneath that had never had the freedom to find its expression. And that's why my own psyche was beneficent. Symptoms that give us distress are not welcome to consciousness, but it's part of the self-healing system. If you have a fever, you call your physician and so forth, but that fever is the heightened work of the body to crack open, a virus that has just afflicted you. It's protective. Nature is not against us. And when we are against nature, then we're going to have a real problem. That's what the old-fashioned word neurosis meant. We're all divided against ourselves. So the biggest shadow here is how much of our unconscious life and our old childhood adaptations, necessary as they were, so we're not judging them, but how much of a role they play in dictating our contemporary behaviors and the scripts that we seem to be following.
Yeah, so that makes me think about the word I often use, self-authentication, right? Re-authentication of the self in a way. What I'm also hearing, Dr. Hollis, that exploration of that is almost self-recovery towards the authentic self. I was actually going to ask you that what would one expect to return from these swamplands? That what kind of treasure do we get? Because shadow is the word that we're describing. So are we expect to return home with more light? Because I don't necessarily, in my experience, I don't find that I'm shining brighter, but I have expanded my energetic field and the comfort zone in my relational experience. What would you like to say to that?
Sure. In a way, you become more fully yourself. Not every aspect of which is always pleasant. For example, how do you handle anger? How much of a role does fear-based activity show up in your life? Where do you need to sort of go back to the drawing board? These are questions that invite shadow exploration, and they're not welcomed by the ego usually. You said you like discovery. Well, yes, some of the discoveries, some of them won't be so pleasant. So you need to say that this is where that notion of accountability, what I don't face in myself gets spilled into the world through me. So it's ultimately an ethical thing to do for our society. It's a loving thing to do for our partners. For example, we all have unmet emotional needs. Well, are you looking to the company, the corporation, to address those needs? Do you expect your children to carry that burden? Have you nominated your partner to be the one who's going to make your life work for you? Well, maybe not intentionally, but that's often the case. So you really have to say, but that's my responsibility, not theirs. It's my
Mm,
job, not theirs. And when Jung said the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent, I think
mhm,
that's really strikes home as a parent. That tells me I have to recognize what kind of model, what kind of outer, expectations am I asking my children? My children, of course, are grown up and so forth by now, but and of course, who makes babies? Young people. So young people themselves are just trying to get out of their own families of origin and create a provisional life out here and form relationship, find careers, do this, do that, etc. All necessary and good stuff. But we're either serving the dynamics of family of origin or cultural influences like religion and education and so forth, or we're trying to run from it. Either way, we're profoundly influenced by it. It's not coming from something deep within. So, just to give another example, my family of origin was of kind and loving people, but also troubled by their life circumstances. And so our life was very difficult because of health issues, economic issues, and so forth. And unbeknownst to myself, because I always loved learning and so forth, I over-identified, and I couldn't have known it at the time, over-identified with the life of the mind, which is what led me to academia, as a way of trying to be above it all. It's not that I didn't have feelings, it's like I wanted to rise above them so I didn't have to
mm,
fall into that place, you see. And that's why, again, the psyche reached up at midlife and pulled me under. It's saying, we're not going to let you get away with
mm,
not dealing with these issues. Well, that was not a pleasant experience, but I learned a tremendous amount from that. And
mm,
and so it's not about being good, it's about being whole in some way. We never reach wholeness, of course, whatever that would look like, because the conditions are constantly shifting. But to come from a more authentic place. So in my family, for example, again, all well-intended, good people, one was not allowed to be angry, even if one had been injured in some substantial way. So where does that anger go? Well, one of the definitions of anger is, is of depression rather, is anger pushed
yeah.
down. Another one is learned helplessness. Well, I learned both of those messages very strongly from my family.
Mm,
Again, I don't say that judgmentally, I say it descriptively. And therefore coming to terms with the magnitude of feeling that had been put in the basement, and including anger, was an important aspect of opening one's life up to a more honest engagement with the world. We're never free of the shadow. The moment I say I'm on top of this, I'm already caught in an inflation. There was an old saying: the devil's cleverest wile is teaching you that he doesn't exist. In other
mm,
words, the moment I think I'm free of something, it still has me in its grip. One of my analysts in Zurich many years ago had a cartoon, and it had no caption. You didn't need one, but it was a corner of a building, and there are two streets meeting at that corner. And down this side is a priest grinning broadly because he's got a little devil at the end of a dog leash, and he's so pleased with himself because he's captured the devil, so to speak. And on the other side, and they're about to collide, is a devil with a little priest on his leash, you see. So you didn't need a caption. You just knew that each carried
yeah.
within the shadow. And at the moment I think I'm in charge, the moment I think I'm on top of that, that's when the shadow has me, because that's the kind of story we tell ourselves, frankly, to remain unconscious. So other shadow elements, for example, are attitudes within us. First of all, is the fantasy that we know enough to know enough, when in truth, while we may have to make choices, we never know enough to know enough. Therefore, you better approach it with a bit more reflection than you think is necessary. We are lazy. This is hard work to do. And often people don't do it until the consequences have built up that they're going to have to face something. And there's an intimidation factor, like I really don't want to deal with that. So, all right, if you don't want to deal with it, but don't expect any change. Don't expect any growth. And don't expect evolving relationships either in any positive direction.
Yeah. That makes me think, Dr. Hollis, like whether we are journeying into the swampland or the basement, right? We can say to our family, okay, I'm going to go to the basement a little bit. And then it's filled, right, with all the family heirlooms and societal heirlooms and all that. And first of all, we need to make some way in there to get in it and then deal with all the dust and dirt. And then we need some time and a space to do that. And then when we come back, we're a changed person. Maybe the people around us don't know what to do with this anymore, especially like if we had some codependent relationship or we connected through anger, whatever. So what would you say to people as they prepare such a visit? And then what do they need to do to acclimate back to the
Well,
life?
sure. First of all, to ask the question, and it's not easily answered, and I've mentioned this before in passing, of any behavior, of any significant choice, ask yourself, what is this really in service to inside of me? Now, you can't just easily answer that because the easy answer is the reflexive protection of this whole system. But you have to say, where is this really, what is this really addressing inside of me? Again, is it a fear-based response? Am I trying to fit in? Or is this my insecurity that's pushing me into this sort of thing? That's not a pleasant conversation, but if you don't have it, then that unaddressed stuff is what's making your choices for you and creating the patterns and the consequences and so forth. In addition, and what I'm going to say now sounds so obvious, but I know I had to learn it at midlife, we are equipped with clues. I've already mentioned one, that's psychopathology. In other words, our symptoms. We have symptoms all the time, like boredom, disaffection, fear-based responses, right? They are the psyche's way of saying there's some mismatch here between your inner life and what's going on in your outer life. Maybe you need to look at that more systematically. The feeling function. Everybody knows they have feelings, but did you ever stop and realize that, again, feelings are autonomous, qualitative analyses of what's going on in your life? So, for example, let's say often people at midlife, and as I said before, this happened to me, who do all the right things, and yet it doesn't feel right inside. You don't create your feelings. They are responses of the autonomy of the human psyche. It's responding. So if you're doing the right things, well, defined by whom? Your culture, your family, whatever. Thirdly, to pay attention to energy systems. When you're doing what's right for you, the energy supports you. When it's not right for you, you can force it. And over time, as we all know, it leads to burnout, boredom, depression, self-medication, burnout. So again, if you can align yourself, I'm 84 and not in the greatest of health physically, but I'm working as hard as I ever did because I care about my work. It's meaningful. And that's the most important thing of all. If what you're doing is truly meaningful, doesn't mean that it's easy, doesn't mean that it's conflict free. It means your system is supporting you in that process. There are times in life when we have to go do things we don't want to do, like to earn a living or take care of our family or whatever. But again, over time, if you're not doing what's right for your soul, there's always going to be this fatal disassociation that occurs inside of us. And it's that keeps one from embracing one's life fully. You're not bringing who you are to the table of things. Now, Jung said, and I think this is very important, and you just touched on it. He said, there are times we have to leave the collective. I ultimately left a tenured position at a university that was very hard to achieve, and I enjoyed it. But I also knew there was another kind of conversation that would take me much deeper than the life of the classroom. And you sometimes leave the collective to go on your journey. And that's not selfish. It's serving the soul, in effect, the reality of your own psyche. But you pay for that debt of having left the other world by coming back to it as a more evolved person. You have to bring the gift of who you are. And by the way, not everybody's going to like that, right? But it will be right for you because it's more authentic as defined by your own nature. Again, we're born with a link to our instinctual guidance, but because we're tiny and dependent, we have to adapt constantly. And we have to ask ourselves, what happened to that visionary child? What happened to that spontaneous personality that we once were? You see, that's part of our shadow issue. What happened to that sense of joy and growth and discovery and so forth? And by the time we reach adolescence, it's usually pretty much lost in the thousand adaptations that are obliged in our world. And I don't want to be idealistic here. You know, we do have to interact with the world. We do have to earn a living. We do have to tend to relationships. We do have to show up and be accountable for our citizen roles. But beneath that, why are you here really? And another way of putting this, it sounds overly simplistic, but I think in the end is not. First half of life is often an unavoidable mistake. Not that you can do anything about this, like get out of home, go out, create a life, do your best, and at some point resurface. And then say, now, why am I here? And in service to what? Because the first half of life, you're either serving the messages you got from your family and your culture, or you're trying to run from them. Either way, they're playing a substantial role. Now, if a truck runs over you at midlife, you could say, well, the person lived the socialized existence that was created by their environmental influences. Second half of life, it's really about, all right, what is seeking expression in the world through me, which is quite a different question. And that's a humbling question. It means you may have to take risks in your life. You may have to, leave a comfortable job for one that's far more challenging. You may have to make economic choices that are difficult, et cetera, et cetera. No one's saying this is easy, but the rightness of it is outside of your hands, so to speak. It gets confirmed by the feeling inside of, this is a meaningful journey for me. This is something that matters to me. When I was a child, like many children, I thought what I want to do when I grow up was be a major league baseball player or something like that. Well, I wasn't given the body for that. And I would have never guessed as a child that I would spend half of my adult life, maybe more now, listening to the suffering of other people. But I do that as a therapist, and I can't imagine anything more meaningful than being invited to be sharing people's journey. That's a conversation between two human beings on the same journey, strung out along the way, perhaps, that is, again, profoundly meaningful. It's a very deep relationship and a deep conversation, one that I couldn't have known as a child was possible. And yet it's there where our human nature, I think, is most expressed. It's where our life is the richest, and it's often in the place of things that are difficult.
So there is that search for meaning and more fulfilled life I'm hearing from you. I often say that the first half of our life is needed for for us to resolve and understand who we are in the second half of our life.
That's right.
Yeah, and that also made me think about the metaphor that Carolyn Mace uses, the mystics without monasteries, right? We don't have monasteries to do it. As you were saying, we need to tend to life while we are figuring out the meaning of that. Thank you so much for such a wonderful, rich conversation. Anything else you wish to share about people who are interested, maybe not so interested? How can they prepare? Anything else we haven't touched about the shadow that you wish to share with as we bring it to closure?
Well, I'll go back to our beginning. Don't think of the shadow as synonymous with evil. Think of it as the unacknowledged, unclaimed parts of ourselves that we need to know are there, and they need to be respected, not necessarily lived out, but to be at least respected. When Jung said life is a short pause between two great mysteries, it's essential that we keep asking it. So what am I to do with this pause? Don't look to someone else to tell you what to do. The answers lie within you. Someone else could potentially help you with that conversation, or I wouldn't be a therapist. But ultimately, what is wanting expression in the world is for you to discover, and that's a very rich journey. In the medieval legend of the Grail, which was the knights searching for something that was sacred to them, the text says to us, and this comes from about the 12th century. They swore to undertake the journey to find what they were seeking, and each knight took himself to a place in the forest where there was no path, for it'd be a shameful thing to take the path that someone else has trod before.
Mhm.
And there you get that sense. You're here to live your journey. You can learn from others, but yours is separate. No one's existed like you on this planet. And somehow, and this is part of the grand mystery of it all, you're to bring the small chip that we are to the great mosaic of life.
Mhm.
In the end, we die. Whether there's a life after that or not, well, maybe we'll find out. We'll see. Whatever it is now, it's hard to imagine with our puny ego capacity. But while you're here, do you experience some depth of spirit that you know is guiding you? Emily Dickinson said once in 1863 in an aphorism, "The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can." And I think it was her reference to the fact that as outer institutions become less and less authoritative, one needs to have an inner compass. Do you know you have a compass? Do you trust it? Do you consult it? Do you respect it? If you do, you're less at the mercy of what's going on outside of you and more a self-generative person, always in service to the life of the spirit, not necessarily to the old scripts, complexes, and scenarios that our world has given us.
What a beautiful way of ending this. Thank you, Dr. Hollis, being with us today. I appreciate your time and wisdom.
You're welcome, and best wishes to you.
Thank you.